you're kind of constantly behind and constantly thinking about something that you don't quite yet need. To me, that's very exciting.
Welcome to Chilltown, where tech meets the love, where CTOs share the tales and the comments of startups do big names, innovations unfold. How many CTOs will share their stories untold?
We've got this podcast we're doing, Scott, and
Mhm.
people probably want to know who we are. So
Well,
tell me a little bit about yourself. Tell the listeners about yourself, Scott.
I would love to. My name is Scott Porad. I was born and raised in Seattle, Washington, where I still live, although I lived in a few other places for little bits of time, but mostly Seattle my whole life. And I have been working doing consumer-facing internet my entire career since 1995 is when I got my first job doing it. I got a job building a website for a department at the University of Washington, where we both went to school. And I didn't really have any plan when I graduated, but math and computers always came naturally to me. I didn't have any intention of getting into software or technology or anything like that. Uh, and that came easily to me, and it's continued to come easily to me. And at that time, the internet, the internet as we know it, the sort of commercial internet, the World Wide Web was just coming into being. And everybody was learning how to do it in real time. And it was easy. I took to it naturally, and I learned quickly, and I just rode the wave as it happened. And so I've been doing that. That's almost 30 years. I'm embarrassed to say how long it is. It makes me feel so old. And I've been fortunate. I've almost always worked in early stage um, companies that are, either at the very beginning or have just recently started. With the exception of what I'm doing now, I've joined a company that's actually quite a few years old. But other than that, mostly it's early. It's almost all been consumer internet, a little bit of enterprise type internet stuff, but mostly consumer facing. And I have always gravitated toward uh, kind of whatever was newest and hottest and exciting what was going on. I like the figuring it out part. Can we make it work? um, as opposed to the when you get more into the optimization phase, I don't find it quite as interesting. And so, as I mentioned, I've done a lot of early stage things. Some have been tremendous success. Some have been complete flops. Startups that never either started or upped. Had lots of ideas along the way. If I had a nickel for every folder where there's a project in there that got started, oh, this is a great idea. We should do this, and you start coding away at it, but then it just peters out. I would have a pile of nickels for sure. And I've just did a bunch of things. I started out early. It was just in kind of building websites. Then I got into online media. I worked on one of the earliest versions of ESPN.com. I worked
You
at a
were at
company
Starwave,
called
weren't you?
I was at a company called Starwave. That's right.
Yeah.
And at that time, we were doing online media, and the piece that I was doing was what we would now call content management systems. At that time, we
Yeah.
called it automated publishing.
Right.
Um, but figuring out how to do content management systems, and I actually at 3 different companies did that, and I really enjoyed trying to figure that out. I then it worked in some e-commerce. The whole world was figuring that out during the first dot-com boom. And then did sort of social media user generated content during the sort of Web 2.0 boom. And then got into the gig economy, the sharing economy space, um, and did that sort of during that boom. And then I met you at a company called 98.6, which
During the
was
online virtual health boom.
during the online virtual health boom during the 2020 pandemic, right? The COVID pandemic. So did that for just a little bit. I worked with you there. That's the first time we worked together. And as I've said to you before, I felt like I found a kindred soul amongst a sea of lost souls. So it was fantastic to get to work with you. And then I went and have since then worked 2 more times in gig economy businesses. So I've done 3 gig economy businesses. I just said that really fast. I should say that. So say gig economy businesses 3 times slowly.
Yeah, exactly.
So that's what I've been doing, and I missed the Bitcoin boom. The cryptocurrency thing was never for me, never resonated with me. Um, and at first, I was an AI skeptic, although I have started to turn around on that as I've started to figure out. I mean, not just me, but as I've started to see ways that it's being figured out how it can be used in like meaningful ways. And
Totally.
so, I don't know if I'll do an AI kind of startup or something like that, but it's something that more recently has caught my attention. I'm not a AI cheerleader yet. I'm not like all rah rah AI, but you definitely start to see some cool things, and you start to realize, wow, I mean, we're in the first few pitches of the first inning with AI, and this is going to be maybe scary powerful. I understand a little bit more now with the ethicists. So you call them the ethicists, and people
Mhm.
concerned about the ethics of AI were thinking about, um, because you can start to see how this stuff is really going to take off. So
Yeah.
that's been my career. I've done some fun things. I mentioned, healthcare 98.6, where we work together, um, which didn't healthcare didn't resonate with me that much in terms of the technology side of it, I should say. But I've done some fun things. The first time we met was a company I was working at called Cheeseburger. That was sort of during the Web 2.0 era, which was user generated content, all sorts of humor and internet memes kind of things.
Yeah.
That was a lot of fun. Uh, ESPN was a lot of fun. We mentioned that earlier. And probably the biggest success I had was with a company called Rover during the gig economy time, where we um, built an online marketplace for pet care services, mostly dogs, but cats as well, and all sorts of other funny animals. There were squirrels and horses and snakes and all sorts of things people need pet care for. But that was a fun thing as well. And what I think connects a lot of the fun stuff together is how fast they grew. In every case, you sort of felt like I had the tail of the tiger, and I was just holding on for dear life. And
Totally.
that is addictive, actually.
Yeah,
Um,
it is. That's one of the reasons startups are so fun.
yes, well, it's interesting you say startups are so fun. Startups are well suited for masochists, right? People who like to hurt themselves, and so I guess that's who I am. And currently, I am not really at a startup. I am leading the engineering team for a company called TaskRabbit. TaskRabbit is a gig marketplace for home services. It operates in the United States, Canada, and Europe. Um, Thousands of tasks and taskers happening every day, millions of tasks a year getting done through the platform. And it's a little bit more mature of a company. It's actually the oldest company I've ever worked for. 15 years is the age of the company. I've never worked for a company more than 8 years old before. I worked for two companies that were 8 years old. And for both of those companies, I was there for all 8 years that I worked
Exactly.
there. So this is something new for me to come in a little bit later and help a team that wasn't really doing very well. And there's a lot of reasons for it around the team, not just the people on the team, because they might hear these podcasts, and I want them to know it wasn't just the team. It might have been the team, might have not been the team, but it takes a family or a village, right? And so much of the whole organization has to be lined up right to help engineering thrive. Just like for a company to thrive, engineering has to thrive. So um, we're trying to help bring that team to the next level right now and grow that business as well. And the last thing I'll say on that is an interesting thing about TaskRabbit is it's entirely owned by IKEA. And before I worked for TaskRabbit, my wife and I have been big IKEA fans and big IKEA shoppers for a long time.
Yeah.
We've learned how to navigate their stores peacefully, and how to make it work for us. We've learned a lot about their products and have thought highly of them, for what they are. I mean, they're not the Rolls Royces of furniture, but for what they are. And getting to then come inside IKEA and see that company from the inside has been really fascinating. It is the best way I can describe it as a magical place. Now, of course, I have, stars in my eyes about it, but, IKEA is 80 years old. It has an incredibly strong culture, an incredibly strong set of values, and it is a well-oiled machine.
My sense as an outsider is that it's super intentional, and
Incredibly intentional.
that intentionality probably helps define their culture and everything about them, their values and everything.
Absolutely. It is so incredibly thoughtful how they do everything. That has served them extremely well over the years. There's times it doesn't serve them well when the market is shifting quickly and they need to shift quick. That doesn't help them as well. So, for instance, IKEA was a little behind the ball on e-commerce. They thought, figuratively speaking, well, who is going to want to buy furniture online? Well, it turns out
Right.
people buy everything online. So they got caught playing a little bit of catch up there, but it's really amazing to see a mature company that's developed its culture and values and, like you said, thoughtfulness over the years. And it's remarkable to see a company where people are lifers and they buy into that culture and they create that culture. And that's how you create a company like IKEA. Last thing I'll say about IKEA, IKEA is also similar to Patagonia, owned by a not-for-profit foundation. So the profits it makes goes to charitable causes, which is also like very meaningful, right? Often we're just working to make money for venture capitalists or investors or something like that. And so it's nice to do something where you're making something for some good for the world without us and not necessarily doing a thing that's good for the world. That's sort of been my story. And I'll say one last thing about my story if I can. I didn't mention this, Brad. I'm an engineering leader now. I've done a little bit of everything. I started out kind of as a web programmer, learned how to be a programmer. I was an engineering manager. I worked for 3 or 4 years as a product manager. I like to say I've sort of done everything except for design in the whole thing, so I would be a terrible designer. I worked as a manager, product manager. I worked in IT for a little bit while and worked in what we would now call DevOps, but technical operations. And it was all those kinds of experiences I had that got me my chance, my sort of first CTO job. It sort of felt like I'd done everything and was well-rounded. And then have been in engineering leadership since then, with the exception of I had a 6-month detour to be work in marketing, and I was terrible at it. I failed, and went back to work in engineering. But I learned. I mean, I learned a lot about how marketing works. Gave me a whole new respect for that discipline, and so I think part of what got me to where I am in my career is just having done kind of a lot of it, a lot of the different roles. Um, and it, as I said earlier, this is sort of a team sport, and being able to have been in a lot of the different shoes as a leader makes it easier to bring people together and bridge gaps, just because I can kind of see where people are coming from.
100%. Yeah.
That's my story.
That's
What's your story?
I love it, Scott. It's so interesting. You and I met years and years ago, back when you were at I Can Has Cheeseburger and I was at Revenue Science. We were both CTOs at that time. And I, like you said, when we worked together at 98.6, really hit it off with you. And it's so interesting to hear, you tell your story in more detail, than I think we pick up, in our acquaintances and working together, because there's so much of your path that feels similar to my path. And maybe that speaks to why we hit it off and uh, sort of seem to understand each other. I too have basically my entire career spent in Seattle. I can't claim to be born and raised in Seattle. My dad was in the army, so I kind of moved all over the place. But I was born in Washington, went to the University of Washington, just like you did. Came out of the UW in the late '80s and started my career at Asymmetrics, which was Paul Allen's company that he started after Microsoft, after he left Microsoft. Um, and really hit the, just like you with Starwave, the internet was just starting to happen. And in '94, I went to a little company called RealNetworks. I was like employee. There was about 12 of us there when I started. And I rode that through going public, and and ultimately ended there 8 years later as a VP of engineering for our systems division, which had like like 500 engineers in it, and we were building all the audio video codecs for streaming, the early days of streaming on the internet. Um, and so I would definitely kind of that probably chalk up to one of my more like obvious successes, helping take a company public and
Mhm.
growing my career in that way. Um, After that, I kind of got my first CTO gig at Revenue Science. That's where I was at when you and I met, and that was another kind of example of a. We were really early on behavioral ad targeting. We were one of the earliest behavioral ad targeting companies, and we'd actually done some other really interesting stuff. We kind of built like our own internal proprietary like NoSQL database before NoSQL is a thing, but we were processing about 1 billion transactions a day of intent data from AOL and Wall Street Journal and Kelly Blue Book, and we were just like munging all this stuff together into behavioral ad targeting. So that was a pretty exciting like early days of something that now is uh, commonplace in the internet. Targeting
Mhm.
people based on the interest that they indicate. Um, I From there, I actually left there as CTO, and started my own company. That I learned a lot from that process. It was it was an early social network focused on sort of like fitness and wellness.
Hmm. I did not know that part of your biography.
Yeah, it didn't go anywhere. That's why you don't know it, 'cause it was a failure. We bootstrapped up to, we were doing a fair amount of, like, traffic, but it was, like, at the dawn of the web 2.0, and, we couldn't quite keep up with, the other sort of networks that were out there in that niche thing, and ultimately, we saw that, like, social networks stopped becoming niche. They became, like, all
Mhm.
inclusive, kind of like the Metas of the world, and so but it was a great learning experience. Kind of wore the founder hat, wore the CEO hat, wore the CTO hat as well, and so it was just like it was a good experience. And for a bit after that, then I kind of put my shingle out as like a fractional CTO and worked with a ton of really interesting startups in the space where I would kind of help them build their teams up. I One of those ultimately turned into a full-time gig where I was the CTO of a company called Choreo. This was years after my startup, but it was a similar sort of like youth sports social network type product. And then After that, I became the CTO of a company that was working in the VR space, early days of VR before the headsets existed, but the early version of the DK1, the developer kit 1 by Oculus, before Meta bought them, was starting to be out in prototype form, and we built a software platform that was basically a metaverse software platform. So that was a pretty exciting time, and that was another company where it was, I got to pivot from just being the CTO, running large teams to, writing code again, hands-on code. And that was a lot of fun. That project. Um, I did that for I think almost 8 years actually, and then left for a bit, did a little sabbatical, kind of went into the mountains, became a ski patroller, spent the year of COVID actually in the outdoors, and avoiding small spaces and people breathing on me. And then I basically ran into you at 98.6, kind of left the mountains and joined 98.6 during their massive growth phase, and you and I kind of uh, reacquainted ourselves with each other and got to work together. That was a lot of fun. I think that kind of like you, I think that healthcare is a really tough space, and I think that uh, I took it on because I kind of love taking on challenges and learning new things. Just like going into VR was a thing that I'd always wanted to do, computer graphics, but I hadn't really done a lot of computer graphics. So that was kind of, I was drawn into that space. Um, and the being pulled into healthcare kind of was like, oh, this seems really important. Maybe I should, go jump into that, into the fray there. But you're right. It was very, I mean, at least for me, it was uh, a difficult space to to work in, but I enjoyed the time there, and I think that I walked away from that with a a lot of really interesting lessons about how cultures impact uh, team efficiency and
Mm,
how easy it is for good ideas that seem good on paper to sort of actually make things more challenging for a team to be high performance. And so I think that's kind of what I felt like I learned a lot from that experience from there. After I left that, I kind of went back to the fractional CTO work, and uh, about a year and a half ago, got really, really busy again with another company. Actually, interestingly enough, is actually High Fidelity again, but they kind of wound down and stopped doing the VR stuff, and they started up a new project in remote work. And um, we're in the early stages now at pre-MVP of a really interesting tool that we've done a couple pilots with customers, but it's a tool that basically encourages collaboration and connection with remote teams, and it's just something that I'm uh, really passionate about because for 8 years before the pandemic, when I was at High Fidelity, the VR company, we were a fully remote team, and so I'm a big believer in the power of remote teams and being able to tap into um, talent no matter where they happen to be, so long as you can develop systems, processes, and culture that um, can facilitate and really allow those team members to shine. Um, yeah, so that's kind of my career trajectory. It's always been in the startup space. I love the startup space. I love the fact that you get to wear so many hats. You get to you constantly are facing new and unique challenges. Um, those challenges can be anything from technical challenges like how are we going to solve this problem of streaming video over 28.8 modems, those early technical challenges like that to um, you know, uh, even simple things like, well, how do you design a culture of quality in a small team, in a new team? How do you like, maybe you've got a bunch of junior engineers that don't have a ton of experience, and you're trying to help them understand how to shape their work processes and their style and their culture so that they kind of build quality in and speed in, and kind of constantly balancing the golden triangle that we talk about. And so it's super fun. I can't I mean, the largest company I ever worked for, uh, and the oldest company I ever worked for, was RealNetworks. When I left there, I'd been there for 8 years, and they were, like, maybe 1,800 employees at that point when I left. Um, but I've been in the big company, but I'm almost always in the, somewhere between the 10 to 100, and that space is a lot of fun. You still can know
mhm,
everybody. You can still you know you you know you get to really understand everybody's personalities, and you can kind of develop uh leadership styles that allow you to really um get the most out of everybody by really sort of knowing them and knowing them, how their what their authentic self is, so that you can really kind of leverage that and tap into that. And I think that's just so much. I get a lot of joy out of that,
mhm.
that process. So
Can I
yeah,
ask you a question?
absolutely.
You had mentioned you've done some interim CTO types of things, maybe some coaching, advising, things along the
Yeah.
way. Are you still doing that, or are you totally focused now on this new project?
It's so funny you asked me that. I've gotten recently, several people have reached out to me. I literally was driving to the mountain over the weekend and got a call from somebody who's like, "Here's my problem. Can you come in and help?" And so um I'm pretty busy with my current project, but I love helping other folks out. So I
Mhm,
definitely do advisory stuff for folks. There's a handful of different entrepreneurs that know me from my past that when they start kicking up new things, especially like I had when I was really doing that more actively, I feel like my specialty was entrepreneurs who weren't necessarily technical themselves, like they had, kind of tech they worked in tech companies, but they were either on the sales, product, or marketing side of things, and they had this idea, and they would come to me because they knew they worked with me in the past, and they knew my skills, and they would say, like, "How do I make this happen? How do I build this thing?"
mhm,
And in fact, the team that I'm working with most recently, the team I'm working on now, like, founder reached out to me, and he basically had an idea that was going to leverage some of the assets that they had from the early VR days, and it was basically a kind of a back of the envelope. I have this idea. How do I get started?
mhm.
And that's a lot of fun. Like being able to bring your skill as a technologist. Like we're so I think one of the things that sort of most technologists like you and I are really good at, sort of like putting the puzzle together, right?
Yeah.
Like you've got this idea of what you want to build. Here's how we can build. Let's step it this way, this, right? We can step it together and we can make progress pretty quickly on implementing an idea, and that's a lot of joy. So yeah, I still do some advising, a little bit of uh, you know, I don't have multiple currently. I'm not doing multiple fractional CTO stuff because I'm pretty busy on this project. But yeah, I'm taking on. I love talking to other people and helping get their project rolling, and then see where it takes it.
Yeah, I always feel like I have a little bit of a pay it forward obligation. When I was early in my career, so many people, either just through replying to an email or taking a phone call or meeting for a coffee, helped me out. And so, I can't always do it because life is busy, but, as much as I can, I try to help out. At the moment, I just have one. I've done all these things as well. I have one coaching client right now, and a CEO who's also the CTO of their company. That's pretty interesting. And I'm actually an advisor to a not tech company, to a
Oh,
company in the grocery space, which is interesting. Now, it's
nice.
interesting because you start to learn that a lot of these non-tech companies have a lot of technology in them,
Yeah.
which is pretty interesting. Um, I've been noticing that lately, with like in airports and hospitals, like just the amount of technology in those facilities is just kind of mind blowing when you start to look at it. And airlines. So that's been interesting to be involved with. It's a startup. It's a younger company, a company that's trying to get off the ground. So I've been able to bring that experience to help them out. And then bring some technology experience, but more on the how do you get something started side.
I was gonna say the other thing that happened. I'm curious if you've run into this sort of thing. I know I've got this happens to me often when I have um, non-tech founders who reach out to me and I start chatting with them. One of the things that I feel like um, I I enjoy doing and I think happens often is being that translator between the non-technical product owner, non-technical founder, and helping them understand what if they have a team, maybe they're working with some sort of like outsourced team to build a prototype or something like that.
Mhm,
You and I talk about that notion of kind of being the Rosetta Stone, the translator, and
mhm,
it's so interesting how common those themes are. The last couple advisory projects that I did was a lot leaning into a lot of that, like helping
mhm.
kind of vet. You're hearing this from your outsourced tech team. Let me translate that for you. Here's what they're trying to say to you. You know,
Right.
here's what you should ask them for clarifying questions for.
That on that second point, yeah, I think a theme of something I've talked to a lot of people about, non-technical folks, is here's how you manage your engineering team. Like, this is what you need to be asking for from them so that they're doing the thing that you want them to do. Because often
Totally.
that non-technical person just has kind of a vision in their head for the app or the website or whatever they want, but actually to say like, okay, I want a demo every week. I want a list of, I want a roadmap and a demo, whatever the pieces are that you do. We don't need to go into it here, but that is helpful to them. Yeah. So I don't know. I've done more, and I've dialed up the coaching and advising, and I've done some fractional stuff along the way. Has gone up and down over the years. In the last 2 years, it's been on the downslope. Um, I think in the next 4 years, it's going to start to go on the upslope.
Yeah.
I just got some energy back, so I had to recharge. You have to recharge, and I had some time to do that. Um, I've always had this idea that I wanted to do. It's actually part of what spawned this podcast, really. I call it CTO school.
Yeah.
You mentioned, a non-technical co-founder trying to find or work with that engineering leader, find an engineering leader, which is very, very hard. The other side of the coin is to go from software engineer or software engineering team manager to startup CTO is a whole different ball of wax. And I feel fortunate. As I mentioned earlier, I had all these different experiences. I also went to business school, and so like I just had this kind of like mosaic of experiences, for lack of a better word, that kind of put me in a good spot to be able to do that sort of startup CTO thing. And I've always thought, man, needs to be a class on this thing. Like, hey, I'm a engineering director somewhere, or a software engineering manager, or maybe I want to start my own company. And like, it's about so much more than building the software. Like, that's
100%.
maybe, what do you think? 40% of it? Maybe 60 at the most.
It's funny, what I was gonna say is that it's this really interesting balance where it's probably it's almost all about building the software until it's very much not all about building the software, right? And
Right.
it's like you have to that's one of the things that's so exciting about startups is that it's that you're constantly asking yourself, am I ready yet to do dot dot dot? And that dot 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 might be grow the team. Okay, if you're growing the team, then how are you selecting the best candidates? How are you
Mm-hmm.
measuring their performance? Oh, I'm writing this code really fast, and am I about ready to dot dot dot? And it's um figure out, do you need layers of management? Do you need engineering managers? Do you need, and if you have engineering managers, then how do you select those engineering managers, and how do you manage them, and what kind of processes start getting put in place around that, right? And the thing that's so exciting about the 0 to 1 is you're kind of constantly behind and constantly thinking about something that you don't quite yet need.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
that inflection point of when you didn't quite need it yet, and then all of a sudden you tip over and now you needed it last month is just this exciting dance of to me, that's very exciting.
There's one more piece that you didn't mention. My take is that the moment you become the senior most engineering person in your business, and it could be a business of one, right? It could be just you. But when you're that person, you're actually, this is the key thing, I think. You have to recognize you're actually more businessman than engineer, business
Yep.
person than engineer.
Yep. Yeah, you're
Um,
more, yeah, 100%.
you've become a suit, as they say, right? You're no longer the talent, you're the suits.
Yep.
And once I got my own head around that, it actually made working with the business people way easier. Not because I
Oh, for sure.
became one of them, but because I understood what they were trying to accomplish,
Yep.
which is like whatever it was, right? So, and it made me realize that as an engineering leader, you are at the same time like quantum physics or whatever, you're wearing two hats. You're wearing a business hat and an engineer hat, and it's not like you toggle between one and the other, but you're like both at the same time always. I actually sometimes wonder if like marketing people feel that way too, right? They simultaneously have to like think about the creative that's getting built in the campaign and the concepts and whatever marketing people talk about, and its optimization and its spend and its cost and those things, and the business and the output of it all at once at the same time. I wonder if the marketing folks feel that way also.
Yeah. I 100% agree with that, and I think that I have been so fortunate in my career that, um, early on, I got to witness that so up close and personal at RealNetworks, where there was just so few of us, and um, Rob, the founder of that company, was um, so engaged and so passionate, and so um, uh, he was a very strong business person and a very strong technical leader. He
Mhm,
had a vision for what he wanted. He understood what he wanted from a product, and it was great to watch and to learn in that sort of uh, crucible. It was
mhm,
such a intense environment, and I have, my colleagues that I have from those days. We're still friends, and it's like such deep bonds because I think we all were learning so much so quickly in such an intense environment. Um, but it's like, to your point about like understanding the vision of the business person, understanding, having empathy essentially for the
mhm,
business part and not just being the developer.
mhm,
Um, I think that's one of the things that is more accessible for developers that are part of startups
mm,
when they're smaller, because hopefully they're seeing each other. They're seeing their business owners, in the same room, the same virtual room, in the same space, in the same meeting, and that helps make that pivot for those that want to move into
mhm.
leadership, engineering leadership, right? Uh, Makes that pivot of like, you're not just an engineer. You've got to be the steward of the business too.
Well, I feel like we have many episodes. We could do a whole series on making the pivot,
Making the
how
pivot,
to do it.
exactly.
That whole CTO school concept I sort of talked about. We'll discuss that some other time. I've got a whole idea about it. Maybe we can make it come to life on this podcast. Brad, it's been fun. We didn't talk about
Yeah.
skiing once today in our podcast. We stayed focused.
Pray for snow.
This episode of How Many CTOs Does It Take podcast was edited by Saffron Hefta-Gaub. Our theme song was AI generated by Brad. Please follow us on all the social media platforms at How Many CTOs Pod. You can find us on YouTube, LinkedIn, Instagram, Facebook, Threads, X, TikTok, and Patreon, or at our website at howmanyctospod.com. And remember to rate, review, and subscribe on the podcast platform of your choice. Thanks for listening.